These are notes on carbon pools, and there's related matter in your book on pages 379 to 380 and 383 to 388. So first I want to go over just a basic food web, just to give you some terminology. For some of you this will be a bit of review, for others of you it will be new. So obviously this is a caricatured food web. We know that, for example, bunnies aren't actually pink, even though they're very cute when they are. And then the arrows follow what some people say would be the flow of the food. So like the bunny eats the vegetation, so that goes into the bunny. However, what these arrows are actually tracing is the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So it's looking at where the energy goes as it is consumed. And we're going to break this whole food web down into different categories. So the easiest categories are to say that on any food web you have producers and consumers. And the producers are always the autotrophs, so like the plant matter in this case, the vegetation, and then the consumers are the heterotrophs, whether what they are consuming is the producers. So for example, right, the snail eats the vegetation, or a consumer could be consuming another, or like another consumer. So like this odd bluebird here consumes the snails. Either way, everything up here that is not producer is a consumer. We also have things called specialists. So specialists are organisms that only eat one type, or maybe even a very few, but a very limited diet. So for example, the example a lot of people use are monarch butterfly larvae only eat one species of plant. They are consumers, they eat producers, but they only eat a plant called milkweed. And so that becomes a bit of a tenuous existence, because if the milkweed goes extinct, then that's going to push the monarch butterfly to go extinct, because they only eat one food. And then the opposite of a specialist is what's called a generalist, and a generalist eats a varied diet. So, humans are obviously generalists, but if you look at this food web here, the eagle's a generalist because the eagle eats the lizards and the odd blue birds and the pink bunnies. Whereas the lizard here, iguana or whatever the heck this thing is, maybe this is one species of caterpillar, and that's the only thing the lizard eats. Be really careful though, if you're a snail and you eat only producers, but you can eat, 20 different types of vegetation, 20 different species, that's a generalist. So you have to think species, not like human random category. So we can also group these based on what are called trophic levels. So trophic levels have to do with food and at what level things are eating. And we're going to use this term trophic level. We're going to look at what are called trophic pyramids a little later. And so this is going to be really important vocabulary. So in the trophic levels, the first level is again the producers, the autotrophs, all the way down at the bottom. And then though we start to break up the consumers. So the first level after producers we call primary consumers. Those are the ones that eat the producers, and those are all going to be herbivores. So that's another term you've probably heard. Herbivores are animals that only eat vegetation, only eat plants. And so all primary consumers are herbivores. Our next level is what we call secondary consumers, and then we have tertiary consumers, and you can keep going. There's, you could add another level that would be called a quaternary consumer. So some secondary and tertiary consumers are going to be carnivores. Carnivores only eat meat. So for example, the eagle on here is a carnivore. But some tertiary and secondary consumers are going to be what we call omnivores. So like if you look at the bird here, right, the bird eats snails, so that's another animal, but it also eats vegetation. So that would make the bird an omnivore, meaning eats both meat and vegetation, whereas the lizard, which is also a secondary consumer, is just a carnivore because it only eats this funky caterpillar thing. So that should give you a basic idea and some background vocabulary of what's going on with food webs in ecosystems. So now we're going to move, oh, whoops, I forgot, sorry, the all-important decomposers. Decomposers then break down organic matter that's already dead. So decomposers, as we've talked about in class, have a really important function in an ecosystem because if there were no decomposers, things that die and are not eaten by, say, like a bird, would just pile up in an ecosystem and be there indefinitely. So what the decomposers do, they will eat on any level of the trophic pyramid. They can decompose producers, they can decompose tertiary consumers, it doesn't matter, but they'll break down that organic matter. And so I have some lovely pictures that I took one summer when I was in Connecticut. This is it's an organism, an aquatic organism called a skate. And it's got this little ray here, and then this is a crab, and you can see all these bubbly things. Those are actually snails, and so those are snails decomposing these dead organisms that who knows how they died. So keep that in mind, that decomposer is a really general term. It can be an animal like these snails. It can be a fungus like the bread mold we saw in class. It could be bacteria like when we talk about like nitrifying bacteria. All of those are decomposers. So decomposer is not necessarily one type of organism, it's more of the function of the organism. So the only thing that can't, I'm going to say the only thing that can't really decompose are plants. Plants are not decomposers. Okay, so now we talk about carbon pools. So a carbon pool is a large-scale measure of carbon-based molecules in an ecosystem. So if you look at this little, again, drawn ecosystem here, you see there's everything that we now expect to see, right? We've got carbon dioxide in the air. We've got that going into the producer. Okay, here's our producer. We've got the primary consumer here eating maybe nuts that fell from the producer. We've got the secondary consumer apparently lying in wait to kill off the primary consumer. We've got soil decomposers down here. We've got a nice little water cycle going on right here. So this is everything we've kind of come to expect. And so a carbon pool is within an ecosystem where the carbon is kind of hanging out, okay? And we care so much about carbon because all of our living organisms on Earth are carbon-based life forms, but in more recent years we've cared even more about carbon because of how carbon dioxide, so atmospheric carbon, right, this carbon here, affects our environment and affects our quality of life and affects our food supply based on how it affects the climate. And so understanding where the carbon is in the ecosystem is both an interesting thing when you start looking at like, oh yeah, because all life is carbon based, but also a really critical thing when you start thinking about like, how is this going to change, say, food webs that we rely on for our survival. So if you think about like a pool being a collection of stuff. So like a swimming pool obviously is a big thing of water, but you also might hear like you could have like a pool of musicians, meaning now I'm imagining a bunch of musicians in a swimming pool. But like a group of musicians you have to choose from. So think about pool in that sense. So I'm going to go over the pools that we kind of see here and what that means. So first of all, there's atmospheric carbon. So you can always talk about the carbon that's in the atmosphere, and that's always going to be CO2. A little bit of carbonic acid, if you're curious about the chemistry there, I'm more than happy to explain it to you one-on-one. Then we have producer organic carbon, and I'm saying organic because at this point the carbon in the producer is going to be in our big organic macromolecules. So our lipids, our carbohydrates and our proteins. And so obviously that's in all of the producers. So in this picture, it would not only be all in the trees, but it would be all the grass as well. So if you were to add up all that organic carbon, that would be the producer organic carbon pool. Then we have consumer organic carbon, and you can divide that up. You could just say, like, this is the consumer organic carbon. You could say this is the primary consumer compared to the secondary consumers, or you could kind of lump it all together. It really depends on what your focus is. But then we also have soil organic carbon. So this could be from two things. It could be from living decomposers in the soil. So all of these little worms and bacteria and fungus and whatever's down here would be soil organic carbon, but then also dead organic matter in the soil waiting to be eaten. So, leaves fall to the forest floor and they're kind of hanging out near the soil waiting to be eaten. That's soil organic carbon. And so again, you could divide it up. Most people are just going to lump it all together and call it soil organic carbon. And then you also have aquatic carbon, which you may not have in this picture as much because this is a freshwater lake, but in in the oceans, and this is why the oceans are such a carbon sink, you actually have just dissolved carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves well in water. Think about fizzy water, right? That's carbon dioxide. You've got tons of living organisms, whether those are plant-based or consumers. So you've got tons and tons of photosynthetic algae. You've got fish. You've got mammals. So all of those living organisms kind of add in there. And then you have shells of living organisms. So things like clam shells are all carbon-based shells. So yeah, all of that kind of comes together to talk about aquatic carbon. And you could divide up your aquatic carbon pool. So you could be looking at an aquatic ecosystem like an ocean, and you could say, okay, what would the dissolved CO2 be instead of the atmospheric CO2? What would the carbon in the consumers be? What about the carbon in the producers? So you could divide it all up. You could lump it all together if your aquatic, if your waterway is part of a larger ecosystem. So it sort of depends. And this is where, again, we get into the squishiness that is biology. But understanding just what a carbon pool is what's important here. So take a look at these two ecosystems. One is a picture of the Olympic National Rainforest, which is right on the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington State. The other is a Midwest grassland. And I just want you to take a second, maybe pause the video, and think about how the pools of carbon in these two ecosystems may be similar and may be different. So go ahead, pause the video, take a few seconds, and then we'll see what you come up with. So hopefully in the Olympic National Rainforest, you're seeing that there's a high amount of producer organic carbon compared to the grassland, right? We've got these enormous trees. We've got all this moss hanging off of these trees. The floor is littered with, ferns, stuff like that. So compared to the grassland, much more producer organic carbon. But then if you look at the grassland, and this is something many of you may not be aware of, there's actually probably going to be a higher amount of soil organic carbon compared to the forest. And that's because grass goes through such a seasonal shift that it's constantly being decomposed back into the soil, which is why the Midwest is such great fertile land for growing crops, right? We don't grow a lot of crops on the Olympic National Peninsula, part of it because it's a national park, but the soil is actually not that fertile there. Where you get the fertile soil is in the Midwest, where you've got this seasonal grass that's constantly being decomposed and enriching the soil. But then realistically, probably these two ecosystems have relatively similar amounts of organic carbon overall. We would have to add it up, and I'm not interested in doing the research to do that. And there are going to be ecosystems where you can look at it and go, oh yeah, that one definitely has less organic carbon overall compared to that one. These two, it's tough to say, right? Like you got to count in the buffalo too, because here we've got a bunch of consumers. It's possible the rainforest has more organic carbon. I don't know that it matters that much. So really quick, last thing is now that we are moving to some large scale units, we have kind of some new overarching questions. So for our atomic molecular units that we have just finished, we really looked at like where are the atoms moving, where is the carbon, what's happening to the energy, and even looking at our mold, we're still kind of asking that. But now we're going to shift to some large scale questions. So we're going to ask where are the carbon pools in this ecosystem? Okay, how are the carbon atoms cycling among the pools? So how are they shifting from one pool to another? How does the energy flow through the ecosystem? So again, we should be able to divide up matter and energy always. And then how do carbon fluxes change the size of the pools? So a carbon flux is really a large shift of carbon from one pool to another. And that happens when these pools get out of balance. And so one of the things we're going to learn about for the kind of remainder of the unit is what does an ecosystem need to be in balance so that you don't get large carbon fluxes. All right, so if you have questions, make sure you write them down so that you can ask them in class when we go over this. Have a good day.